introduction? Yep, brilliant. Okay, so Bord Pub, good morning. My name is Owen Evans. I'm Chief Executive of Children in Wales and I'm Chair for today's webinar. This is the second of our Children's Rights thematic webinar series. Each of our sessions focuses on a different topic affecting children and young people, and today's topic is poverty. Okay, before we begin, there are just a few items of housekeeping I need to go through. So your camera and microphone will remain off during the webinar. However, you do still have access to the chat bar, so please use that for asking questions. Given the large number attending the webinar today, questions will need to be asked through that chat. So please post them as we go along. We'll keep track of them and then we'll use them during our Q&A session with our speaker towards the end of the webinar. Can I ask that we do just use the chat function for questions only, just so we can keep track of the questions. I would also like to confirm that following the webinar, we will send everyone an email with a link to today's slides. We aim to get these to you within the next few days. Please feel free to share these slides with colleagues and your networks. Finally, towards the end of the presentation, we will post a link in the chat to an evaluation form. There are just 5 questions, and can I ask that you all take the time to please complete this. Your comments are really important to us for the future of our webinars and to help us identify if they are useful and how. So please do take the time to complete the evaluation when prompted. Okay, so as I said, welcome to the second session in this year's series of children's rights thematic webinars. As I said, each of these 6 sessions in the series will focus on a different area which affects opportunities or barriers to realising children's rights in Wales. Whilst we've made great strides in Wales in adopting and implementing the UNCRC, we need to do more in a number of areas, and one such example is around poverty. Poverty contravenes a number of the articles laid out in the UNCRC and denies children and young people many of their rights, including their right to develop their full potential, their right to the best possible health and nutritious food, right to benefit from social security, right to an adequate standard of living, and rights to play and leisure opportunities. On Tuesday, we launched the full report on the findings from our survey. A link to the full report will be posted in the chat at the end of the webinar. So I'd now like to welcome Karen McFarlane, our Policy Officer for Poverty and Vulnerable Children and the author of this report. So Karen's going to share an overview of the findings from both the practitioner and professional survey, as well as those from children and young people. Okay, welcome Karen. Croeso Karen.
Thank you, Owen, and good morning, everybody. As Owen mentioned, the report of the findings of from the survey was published on Tuesday. And this morning I'll be sharing a summary of these findings, which includes the experiences and views of practitioners and also the views of children and young people themselves. Now, as I go through the presentation, you'll see quotes on some of the slides. These are verbatim quotes provided by the respondents, and I'll just leave you to read those as we go along. At this point, and before I start, I'd also like to say that the findings do make for uncomfortable listening and some aspects of them may be upsetting. However, for many of those living in poverty or experiencing poverty, this is often the daily reality for them, and therefore the findings do reflect this. So about the surveys, each year we run 2 surveys in parallel, one for those working with or with a remit for children and families, and the other for children and young people themselves. All of the surveys are completed anonymously, and we only ask for them to identify the local authority area that they work in, and for children and young people, the local authority area that they live in and their age. Now, this is our 6th annual survey, which, as you'll see later, will allow for yearly comparisons. So just a note, you will notice that there is a gap in 2020 as we didn't conduct our normal surveys due to the pandemic. So there are certain 4 questions that we ask in the surveys every year, and these allow us a comparison. However, each year we also include new questions, and that's based on issues that arose in previous surveys or emerging issues. New questions or expanded question areas this year are highlighted here in orange. So I'll start by looking at the findings from the practitioner professional survey and then move on to the children and young people's findings. So we had a total of 155 practitioners and professionals respond, and this was from across all 22 local authority areas in Wales. Responses were from a broad range of sectors and across different age range remits. And as you can see, 79% worked directly with children and or families. And this 79% worked with a minimum of 42,000 families, children and young people. The remaining 21% worked indirectly, but obviously still had a remit for children, young people and families. So one of the core questions we ask is if the situation has changed in the last year for the majority of families they work with. And 94% said that the situation is worse than last year. As you can see, year on year, the situation is getting worse for thousands of families. Now, staying with this 3-year comparison and based on their experiences and observations, we asked practitioners and professionals to choose 5 poverty issues from this list here and rank these in order of the greatest impact. As you can see, almost all of the issues were ranked in the top 5 this year. Obviously, the most notable difference here is the rising cost of living. It is worth noting here that many respondents stated that they find this question the most difficult to answer because they see that every issue has an impact on the other and all of the poverty issues given are inherently interlinked to each other. So the next slide shows the same poverty related issues, but with this year's findings only. So here you can see for this year, which ones were ranked as a top 5 issue and which were chosen as a top issue, the top issue. So given the time today, I'm not going to look at all of these in depth at all, and there's much more information in the report, so hopefully you'll get a chance to read that. However, I will briefly look at a couple of these issues, and starting with the top one, the rising cost of living. So as you can see, 93% chose this as a top 5 issue. They describe the impact of this as far-reaching and tangible to both adults and the children and young people they work with. For example, families are literally now having to choose whether they put money in their meter for electricity or they buy food. Practitioners said that a number of the families could only afford to use electricity on alternate days, let alone heating their homes. So compared to the last few years, this has changed now. It's obviously always been an issue, but it's the first time that we've heard in the survey that families are now choosing to use electricity on alternate days. So the rising cost of living was also cited as having an impact on the physical, emotional and mental health of not only parents and carers, but the children and young people themselves. Respondents said that they were seeing a decline in physical health of adults, as many were choosing not to eat so that they could provide food for their children. This lack of nutrition inevitably had an impact on many parents' abilities to manage, both physically and emotionally. And respondents said that they are now seeing an increase in the number of adult to adult and adult to child relationships which are under strain. And this is definitely having an impact, as we'll see later, on children and young people as well. Sadly, there were many comments about parents feeling hopeless, ashamed, demoralised and having nowhere to turn. The impact on children and young people's health was also just a start. Practitioners said that children are now missing hospital appointments because parents can't afford the transport costs. They also said baby milk was being watered down to make it last longer, and the lack of food was affecting children's ability to concentrate or stay awake at school, and clothing, particularly footwear, was regularly too small. And with the footwear, there were a number of comments saying, with practitioners saying that they were seeing children presenting with foot problems because they'd been in shoes that were too small for too long. It was also particularly concerning that practitioners stated that they're now working with and supporting a rising number of mothers and their children who are remaining in abusive situations. They said this was because the mothers felt that they couldn't leave because they felt that staying in the relationship, regardless of how abusive it was, it did provide them with more financial stability and did enable them to feed their children. Of course, it's no surprise that all of the factors I've just spoken about regularly lead to increased emotional stress and anxiety of both the adults and children and young people. Later on, I will be looking at emotional and mental health a little more in depth. So the next area I want to highlight from the report is debt. This was the second most common issue that was identified. Now, debt was a dominant theme throughout last year's findings as well, and I therefore wanted to explore this a little further in this year's survey, and I included additional questions. Many practitioners identified that debt had increased during the pandemic. However, for many families pre-pandemic, debt was already a significant issue. So the majority of comments on debt stated that on a day-to-day basis, many families' incomes did not cover their basic essentials. And consequently, they were having to go into debt just to get by and feed their families on a daily basis. Where this is the case, practitioners are expecting debt levels and the number of people in debt to increase over the next year. So just a bit more about where the debt is owed. This is the first time we've asked this question this year. And obviously, with the energy price increases, it's not a surprise that utilities is seen as an area most commonly where the arrears were. However, again, it is worth noting that the survey took place just weeks after the first price increase in April. And even at this point, utilities was cited as the most common area. From that, we've taken that it's therefore likely that this was already the situation before the impact of the increases anyway. Obviously, that's just going to get worse now. The cost of rent was cited as a particular issue, with many saying that current benefits aimed at supporting housing costs actually didn't cover the actual cost of the rent. This puts families in a situation where they need to reduce their outgoings in other areas to pay their rent. For example, spending less money on food or not using the heating. There were also a number of comments where families are resorting to unlicensed lenders. This was just to meet their basic needs on a daily basis, but for many, they still weren't able to do that despite using the unlicensed lending money. Comments regarding friends and family was of particular interest. So previously, many families have had to rely on their family and friends to help out. And this isn't just on rare occasions, but on a weekly or monthly basis. For example, they not only provide financial support, but also support in kind. So for example, they may do the laundry, they may do cooking or provide food parcels. However, this year, and there were many comments that the support network of family and friends are increasingly unable to help out now as they too are struggling. So I think down the line, we'll clearly see the impact of that again. So just the final slide on sort of debt and finances. This year we asked about financial support. We know that financial support is available, but we also know that not everybody claims everything they're entitled to. And I wanted to explore this a little further in the survey. As you can see, practitioners stated that the most common reason for unclaimed support was that parents and carers were not aware of what they're entitled to. This was both for UK and Welsh support. Even where families were aware, the process of claiming was often difficult to navigate or understand. There were also a number of comments about the perceived difficulty of claiming. For example, they said that if a parent or carer had experienced difficulty claiming support in area A, then they often perceived that they would have the same experience claiming for support B, and therefore they just didn't try. It's also interesting to note that not everyone has access to the technology in order to make a claim. I think this is particularly related to either a lack of device or a lack of data to use that device. And obviously this is now an area that needs to really be considered as we continually move more services online. We also have here the stigma of claiming, and sadly this is still seen as a barrier by some. Practitioners shared some of their claim experiences of the families, and on hearing these, it's not surprising that some are reluctant to claim. So just an example, a summary of examples given by respondents was that if they go in person to claim, quite often they have to do that process through an open office, and there are other local people present. The claimants are then asked to provide very personal information about their circumstances, and for some this was seen to be humiliating and embarrassing. Clearly this doesn't need to happen, and I'm sure that just small but important changes can be made that will protect both the privacy and the dignity of people in need of support. And just finally, on financial support, large numbers of practitioners stated that they were spending increasing amounts of time trying to help their families claim. And for the majority of these, this was not the main purpose of their work with their families. And whilst this support was clearly needed, it inevitably means that there is little or no time for their main role. And this could be, their main role could be things such as parenting support or providing parenting skills. So the next issue I want to briefly look at is food bank usage. As you can see from this slide, practitioners are seeing an increase in the number of families using food banks this year, with 77% saying that the families were more likely to use food banks compared to last year. Practitioners said that the increased demand for food banks has also in itself created issues. For example, respondents cited that there were empty shelves in some areas and that they were unable to meet the demand. They gave reasons for this, and these predominantly fell into two categories. First, that businesses and supermarkets were being asked to donate by more food banks, and therefore there was less for each site. And the second reason they gave was that the local community are now struggling themselves and are unable to donate. Again, in the report, there's a lot more information on food banks, but just to highlight two areas of concern that did come from the findings. The first was the number of comments about how many times a family can use a food bank. These mainly refer to community or school food banks, but practitioners stated that families in some areas are only allowed to use food banks up to 3 times. What wasn't clear and didn't come through the survey is if the families were ever able to access food once they'd used their 3 times or their stated number of visits. The other area of concern is around how the service is facilitated. You will already have seen and will see throughout this presentation about the emotional impact of poverty on mental health and how it makes people feel. So this is why this is an area of concern. So for example, in some areas, schools now operate a food donation point. And to access this, there are generally 2 ways that they can do this. So in class, pupils are asked to either raise their hands or come forward if they need to use the food bank, need to take food from the food bank. Or the food bank is placed in a busy reception area which parents have to access when dropping off or collecting their children. As similar to the financial support in the previous slide, we don't always consider the dignity and needs of those using the service. So many children and young people actually are embarrassed by having their parents collect food when they drop them off, and particularly in front of their peers, and this is leading to more stress and anxiety. Now, whilst we absolutely should not be hiding this away or asking people to access donation points in the dead of night, we do need to consider what we do and certainly engage service users in the concept and design of these services, just to ensure that we're working towards mitigating the impact of poverty rather than making it worse. I'm going to move on to how poverty affects education now, and this is just a very brief overview of the findings, as each one of these points here is a whole discussion area on its own. The most frequent comments made by respondents about the impact of poverty on education are shown here in bold. And respondents said that poverty creates inequality in all aspects of children and young people's lives, but particularly within their education. For example, they come to school tired, hungry, and this affects their ability to focus, their ability to attain and engage with their peers. In terms of absenteeism and poverty, findings show that there are numerous reasons for this, from lack of money to pay for transport to actually get to the school, lack of school uniform and equipment, even equipment such as pens or bags or PE kits, and right through to emotional reasons such as their own stress and anxiety. But also there were many comments, again from young people themselves as well as practitioners, about the concern that children and young people felt about their parents' own mental health. And in a number of circumstances, the children would rather stay at home to either look after their parents or be with them than attend school. Also, studying out of school hours was also likely to be different. So, for example, young people are working after school now to provide additional income for their family, or, as we heard earlier, may not have electricity or heating at home or access to the internet. And for many, even before the school day starts, they're already at a disadvantage to learning. So my final slide on the findings from the practitioners and professionals is around emotional and mental health, and then we'll look at the findings from the Children and Young People survey and what they said. In our 2021 survey, emotional and mental health emerged as a significant theme throughout all of the findings. This was particularly quite stark because we didn't ask any questions on emotional health in last year's survey. However, as a result of this, I have included specific overarching questions, just so that we can try and understand a bit more about what's going on. So we asked respondents if the emotional health of those they worked with had changed over the last 12 months. As you can see, the overwhelming majority said that the emotional health of both parents and carers and children and young people has got worse over the last 12 months. We asked practitioners to comment on why they'd chosen their answers, and the bullet points on the right on the screen reflect some of the most common reasons they gave. They described many parents and carers as being constantly worried, stressed, and anxious, and this often affected their ability to parent as they would want to, or even to make considered decisions. For children and young people, they are seeing increased numbers who are self-isolating, being disengaged, and also continually living with stress and anxiety. And the practitioner said that this stress and anxiety was particularly around food, debt, staying in their own home, and being worried about their parents. Sadly, they described many children as being depressed and sad and anxious. What was also very stark from the findings was the depth of deterioration and the increase in the numbers who were now felt to be either at a critical point or in crisis. And a significant number of practitioners reported an increase in the numbers of children, young people and parents who were at severe and immediate risk. Some of these children are aged under 10. This was commented on across the wide range of sectors who responded to the survey, and the poor emotional health was also commented on and reflected by children and young people in their own survey. However, I have to say we didn't ask children and young people specifically about emotional health, but they mentioned it so frequently, it was the dominant theme in their survey, in their findings. And sadly, they also talked about severe risk. In terms of support, respondents said that they are making more and more referrals to mental health services, but they also said that the waiting lists are very long for both adults and children. And they felt that this would only increase due to the rising demand that they're seeing and the number of referrals that they're trying to make. Now, I also asked practitioners and professionals about their own mental health, and this was as a result of the number of comments made by them in last year's survey. So the question in the survey simply asked, "How are you?" And this was a completely optional question, and 57% of them did respond. Of these, it was heartening to hear that 44% are doing well. However, the majority of those who did respond are impacted by their experiences. Some practitioners shared that they're struggling financially as well, and therefore it's often difficult emotionally to provide support to families when they themselves are in the same position. Many described the emotional toll this was having on them, leaving them feeling helpless and failing in their role. Now, although some had experienced this for many years, they stated that the situation in recent times was making it increasingly difficult. Some had taken time off with work-related stress, whilst others are actively seeking other employment in order to remove themselves completely from the situation and the sector. Now, where this was the case, again, they expressed sadness and regret that they no longer were able to stay in the role that they did love and had experience and quite often training in. I have to say, though, that despite these circumstances, the overarching concerns of the workforce do remain with the children and young people they work with. And my hope in bringing this to bear, really, highlighting this as an issue, is that everybody starts to understand more about the wider impact of poverty, and I hope that this encourages further conversations and understanding and support within organisations. So it doesn't get better from here, I'm afraid. On to children and young people and their voices. So in this section, I'll look at some of the findings from the children and young people themselves. Again, these are stark and sometimes difficult to hear. So we had 250 children and young people respond to the survey, again, from all across Wales, and their ages range from just under 10 up to the age of 25, so a good broad range. All of the responses were again anonymous, and we only asked children and young people which local authority area they lived in. Each of the questions were also asked in the third person. We chose not to ask children and young people if they themselves lived in poverty, therefore we can't identify how many of them did. However, some chose to answer their questions in the first person, and therefore it's an indication that we do have many children and young people responding who do experience poverty. Again, on this, I've included a few of their quotes, and all of these, again, are verbatim. So we asked them to choose two of the options from this list. As you can see here, overall, the responses over a 3-year period are very similar, with not having enough money to pay for food, heating, or electricity being chosen most often over the years. This year, we included the option about money to go out with friends, and therefore there's no yearly comparison for that. And that may also account for some, because there's an additional option, may account for some of the fluctuations in the numbers in other areas. The survey then asked them to tell us how they think poverty and money affects children and young people. Now, despite this open question, the overwhelming majority of comments focused on the impact poverty had on emotions, self-esteem, not fitting in and feeling anxious. And the bullet points here on the left indicate the most commonly cited areas by children and young people. These emotional aspects that they repeatedly cited throughout are seen in the rest of the survey, and again echo those findings from the practitioners survey. So we asked them about poverty in school, and again, same format, they were to choose two from the list that was given. And generally speaking, children and young people are choosing similar issues each year. Again, the emotional impact of poverty was chosen most often with bullying. So this year, The second most commonly chosen issue was around school uniform or school equipment, which is a bit of a change from previous years. And from the comments they provided, it is clear that not having the correct school uniform was highly aligned with the likelihood of being bullied. So we asked children how we asked how children and young people might be affected by poverty in school. And it wasn't surprising and in line with the most commonly chosen option. Bullying was most frequently cited, and explained that children and young people were often bullied because they didn't have the correct school uniform or even not enough money to buy snacks during school. There were also numerous comments about the experience of witnessing bullying, and some said that whilst they were not bullied, they did feel helpless and sad at seeing it. They wanted it to stop, but didn't know what to do or who to go to or what to say. And this clearly did have an impact on them, even though they weren't directly bullied. Now, the survey did ask specific questions around bullying, and there's much more information about bullying in the report. Other comments about how poverty affected children in school included their learning experience, and that those living in poverty were not able to do the same things as others because they didn't have the same equipment or the right equipment, or couldn't afford to pay for trips and after school clubs. And this was seen as unfair by children and young people, and they clearly stated that all children should have the same opportunities to learn and experience things. Unfortunately, there were also a few examples given where they had been called to the front of the class and had to explain why their uniform didn't fit or why they were wearing the wrong trousers. Clearly, this did have an impact on the young people, and in at least one of the circumstances given, the examples given, the outcome of that was that it increased the frequency of peer bullying and clouded their experience of school and learning. Now, I'm sure you've all read the comment on the bottom of the screen. I've included this because it was one of the very few comments that made me smile from the findings. Whilst its content and the reality is awful, at this point, a large part of me wants to believe that it isn't a spelling mistake of uniforms, but rather that this young person is still able to think about and aspire to owning a uniform despite their circumstances. So I'm going to believe that if they are talking about a unicorn and not uniform. So using the same format, we asked children and young people about poverty and home. When asked to comment, children and young people repeatedly talked about constantly feeling anxious and worried. They were particularly concerned about being able to stay where they lived, being cold and being hungry. The quote on this page is a good example of many of the comments given, and it just really summarises all of the other quotes, really. The next slide simply shows quotes from children and young people about the impact at home. And I'm going to leave you to read these. So I think at this point you'll have an understanding of the stark reality and the findings from the survey. As I said, there's much more in the report. However, instead of giving you more about the dreadful findings, what I want to do is show something positive. So we asked children and young people what can be done to stop bullying. So I'm hoping this is a positive slant in an otherwise overwhelming report. But you can see here that the most frequent solution is given in bold in the bullets, and children and young people were very, very keen that we raise awareness, we increase understanding, and we build compassion about the impact poverty has and about the issues children and young people are dealing with. They're very keen that everybody gets to know about that, just so that we have greater compassion and we don't make some of the mistakes that I've already alluded to, throughout the report. Now, towards the end of our survey, we offer children and young people the opportunity to say anything they want to about poverty. So this is just an open question. Many of the children and young people did respond, and the tone of their response ranged from angry, sad, right through to positive, and a number of them were very insightful. And these are just some of the comments that they did make. And then finally, we also asked them to give an example of something good that happens locally to help families living in poverty. All of those responding cited food banks without, and there was only one exception, and it was from one young person aged 10 to 11 who simply cited Nana. So on behalf of this young person, I'd like to say a huge thank you to all of the nanas who are in a position to help, because it clearly does help some of the children and young people out. So thank you, everybody. I'm sorry that some of the findings were stark, but we clearly need to understand more about this. I think Louise said earlier in the chat that the report will be available, and she'll provide a link to that. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have now, but also if you have questions following this webinar, then please just email me and I'll try and answer those for you. Thank you, Owen.